The Holy Gospel of our Savior Jesus Christ, according to Matthew. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the customs post. He said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. While he was at the table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat with Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees saw this and said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" He heard this and said, "Those who are well do not need a physician, but the sick do. Go and learn the meaning of the words, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." As he was telling them these things, suddenly one of the leaders came and knelt down before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." So Jesus and his disciples got up and followed him. Just then, a woman who had suffered from bleeding for 12 years approached from behind and touched the end of his robe, for she said to herself, "If I can just touch his robe, I'll be made well." Jesus turned and saw her. "Have courage, daughter," he said. "Your faith has saved you." And the woman was made well from that moment. When Jesus came to the leader's house, he saw the flute players and a crowd lamenting loudly. "Leave," he said, "because the girl is not dead, but asleep." And they laughed at him. After the crowd had been put aside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. Then news of this spread throughout that whole area. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. In today's gospel, Jesus said, "Follow me," and Matthew, the tax collector, got up and followed. In the same gospel, Jesus said, "Have courage, daughter, your faith has made you well," to a woman who suffered for 12 years, and she was made well. We hear these stories, they're familiar, they often pass over us. We forget how compelling the words of Jesus must have been, how powerful and magnetic his presence, that when he said, "Follow me," Matthew followed. That when he said, "Take courage, your faith has made you well," the woman was well. It is life-changing to meet Jesus and to hear him speak to you. And we know that Jesus didn't stop speaking at the end of the Bible, at the last page, but Jesus continues to speak to us and to minister to us. One of the reliable ways we have of meeting Christ is through the Bible. Martin Luther said, "The Bible is alive. It speaks to me. It has feet. It runs after me. It has hands. It lays hold of me." Denise Sobolik can attest to the truth of that, and she will share with us now a story.
Good morning. It was the end of a long day when the woman stopped in at the chapel to have a quiet moment alone and say a prayer. It was the end of a long day that had started 2 weeks ago with a phone call and the words, "There's been an accident." Her husband had been in a major car accident and was hospitalized with multiple serious injuries. Spending her days at the hospital watching over her husband and talking to doctors and specialists had become her daily routine. A routine that ended each day with a stop at the quiet little hospital chapel for a moment of solitude and prayer before heading home. Tonight, she was a bit more tired, both physically and emotionally, than other nights. The long days sitting by his bedside were starting to take a toll on her. The waiting was starting to take a toll on her. Days filled with 2 steps forward and 1 step backward, or no steps at all, were starting to take a toll on her. There was so much uncertainty. Would his brain injury resolve itself? Would he walk again? What would the future hold for him, for their family? It was getting harder to be optimistic about this having a happy ending. Most nights she was alone in the chapel for the 10 or 15 minutes she spent there. But tonight, as she sat tucked away in a corner, a couple came in and stopped at the Bible just inside the door to look up a passage. They were talking and discussing the passage as they looked for it and seemed completely unaware that anybody else was in the chapel. She stopped her praying to sit and wait for them to leave and couldn't help hearing what they were saying. They were looking at Matthew 9:20 through 22, the story of the woman who touched Jesus' robe in order to be healed by him. Jesus saw, felt, knew that she was there, and he turned to speak to her, saying, "Have courage, daughter. Your faith has saved you." There are a lot of takeaways from this Bible passage, but the couple were focused on the phrase, "have courage." They kept repeating that phrase and the word courage over and over in the few minutes they were there. They finished looking at the passage and left, still completely unaware of the woman sitting in the corner. The woman, however, was very aware of their presence and their purpose. What else could she do but look up to God and say, "Thank you. Thank you for sending these people to repeatedly utter the word she most needed to hear that night. Courage. Courage to continue to bear the long days. Courage to continue to bear the uncertainty. Courage to know that no matter what the future held, God was with her and her family. Those of you who know me may have recognized the woman in the story. For those of you who don't and haven't guessed, I am the woman in the story. This event happened over 15 years ago, yet it touched me so deeply, I carry the memory of it with me to this day. God heard my prayers that night, and he knew a subtle message was not going to cut it. I needed to actually, physically, hear his words being spoken to me to sustain me through the hardships he knew were going to continue coming my way. I was never in doubt that God was with me during all of that time, and I had amazing support from my family and friends, including many here at Mount Cross, to help me bear the difficult times and to show God's love to me and my family with their words and actions. But I needed more that night, and God provided it. He chose to use 2 unassuming people who were obviously caught up in their own difficulties and dramas to speak his words to me directly, to remind me to have courage, to remind me he was there right beside me. I've often wondered if the couple had second thoughts about coming into the chapel that night. I can hear one of them saying, let's just look it up when we get home. I am thankful they allowed themselves to be nudged to go into the chapel that night. Or maybe not. Maybe they just stopped in. Either way, God used them to get his message to me, and I am thankful for that. So while this verse has much to say about faith and about Jesus, it is the way that God used this verse to speak to me more than the verse itself that makes it important to me. It is a reminder to me that God hears and answers my prayers. It is a reminder to me that God is always beside me. But I think the most important reminder for me is how God uses people, uses me, in ways that we are never even aware of. I hope when I am nudged by God to go here or say that, I resist any temptations to do otherwise, and to let him use me to bring his light and his words to those who need them. Or if I am not being nudged, but I'm being used by God in ways I am unaware of, I hope my words and actions live up to his expectations and desires, and that I am a good steward of his will. As a side note, as I went to write this story, not being a biblical scholar, I had to look up the passage in the Bible. I did an internet search for "woman touches Jesus' robe," and I found the passage. The story is actually in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But when I read the passage in my Bible, the NRSV, none of the versions use the word courage. They all used words peace or take heart. So I went back to the internet and I looked up passages in different versions of the Bible. I found a version, the Christian Standard Bible, that used the word courage, but only in the Gospel of Matthew. I've not done an exhaustive internet search, but it appears to me that the use of the word courage is not a common word for the telling of this story in the different versions of the Bible that are out there. God's work here astounds me even more. That the couple came in, used a version of the Bible that used that word, and picked the one gospel that also used that word. That night in the hospital chapel, or in fact during any of the 2 months my husband was hospitalized, lack of faith was not really an issue for me. I never stopped believing that God was present in our lives, or that he had a plan in place for our lives that we could not see at that time. But as in any long-term, stressful, uncertain situation, having the courage to continue to face everything that is coming your way can become a problem. Some days you just want to say, I can't do this anymore. Stay curled up in bed and give up. You need an extra dose of courage to continue on the path that God has laid out in front of you. That's where I was that night. That is why I needed to hear a Bible verse with the word courage instead of peace. And that is exactly what God provided for me that night. As an epilogue, for those of you who don't know me, my husband survived his injuries. His brain injury resolved itself. He had no spinal injuries. He completely recovered, and we gave tremendous thanks and praise to God for that. But life is never neat and clean. There would be other difficulties to come my way, and I'm sure there will be more to come one way or another in the future. But through them all, I'm able to lean back on this memory and remind myself to have courage and know that I am not alone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denise. You know, on this graduation Sunday, one message that we try to get through to our young people is what you've achieved isn't an end in itself. We hope you'll have a lifelong pursuit of knowledge and wisdom. It's the same thing we told and hope for our confirmation students a few weeks ago, that confirmation isn't the end, it's a start of a life of discipleship. So it's not only 8th graders who need to come up here and tell their God stories. Thank you, Denise, for telling your God story. So I invite all of you to think about, when did the Bible come alive for you? When did you meet Christ? When was a time where you felt the presence and the strength of God? You may not come up here to the pulpit and share it, but you might. Thanks be to God.